My name is Gabriella Norton, though everyone calls me Gabby, and I learned something profound the day I bought a cardboard box full of what my family called garbage. For years, I had been the one who didn't quite fit the mold they'd created. While my brother Victor climbed corporate ladders and collected accolades, I taught elementary school art classes and lived modestly in a small apartment in Hartford. They measured success in salary figures and square footage. I measured it in the smiles of second graders discovering watercolors for the first time. We spoke different languages, my family and they made certain I never forgot which dialect mattered more in their world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The distance between us grew wider with every holiday gathering, every phone call where my mother's voice carried that particular tone of disappointment, every family photo where I stood slightly apart from the rest. But nothing prepared me for what would happen when Grandma Maggie passed away and left behind a house full of memories that everyone else dismissed as clutter. That autumn afternoon, surrounded by strangers picking through her belongings while my own family circled like vultures around her valuables, I made a choice that would flip our entire dynamic on its head and teach me that sometimes the things others discard are exactly what hold the most meaning. The morning of the estate sale arrived with that particular New England crispness that makes October feel both beautiful and melancholic. I drove from Hartford to Riverside in my aging sedan, the heater struggling against the chill, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The 45-minute drive felt longer somehow, weighted down by the knowledge that Grandma Maggie's house, the only place in Connecticut that had ever truly felt like home to me, would soon belong to strangers. The trees lining Route 9 blazed with color, reds and golds that Grandma would have called God's own painting, and I blinked back tears more than once during that drive. She had been gone for 3 weeks, and the wound still felt raw, unhealed, made worse by the speed with which Victor had organized the sale. He'd called it efficiency. I called it erasure. Elmwood Avenue appeared exactly as I remembered it, a quiet street where houses sat back from the road behind old maples and stone walls that had stood for generations. Grandma's Victorian rose up at the end of the block, its pale yellow paint and white gingerbread trim looking somehow forlorn now, like a grand dame dressed for a party no one would attend. But the lawn, her beautiful lawn where she'd spent countless hours tending roses and hydrangeas, had been transformed into a marketplace. Tables covered with white cloths stretched across the grass, laden with her possessions. Dishes, books, lamps, linens, all tagged with prices that seemed insultingly low. Strangers already milled about, picking up her teacups, rifling through her photo albums, handling her life with the casual disregard of people hunting for bargains. I parked on the street and sat for a moment, watching. Mrs. Helen Crowley, the estate sale organizer Victor had hired, stood near the porch with her clipboard and cash box, directing traffic with brisk efficiency. She was a woman who'd made a career of dismantling lives, packaging memories into lots, and I disliked her on sight. Near the garage, I spotted Victor holding court with Uncle Keith and Aunt Patricia, his voice carrying across the lawn in that booming way he had, confident and commanding. He wore a suit even on a Saturday, navy blue with a crisp white shirt, because Victor never missed an opportunity to remind everyone of his status. My mother and father stood nearby, my mother's hand resting on a carved wooden chest that I recognized as one of Grandma's prized pieces, her fingers possessive even before the sale had officially begun. I climbed out of my car and pulled my cardigan tighter against the wind. The air smelled of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke, scents that would forever be tied to this moment in my memory. As I walked up the driveway, my sneakers crunching on gravel, I felt eyes turn toward me. Victor's gaze found me first, and something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or annoyance. He hadn't expected me to come. He'd made that clear during our last phone conversation, when he'd informed me rather than invited me about the sale date. "You don't need to drive all the way down here, Gabby," he'd said, his tone suggesting my presence would be an inconvenience. "We've got everything handled. Besides, most of it's just old junk, nothing you'd be interested in." That word junk had stung more than he'd probably intended, because to Victor, anything without obvious monetary value or status was disposable. He'd already claimed Grandma's jewelry, the silver service, the antique furniture that would look impressive in his colonial in West Hartford. He'd divided the valuable items among himself and our parents with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never questioned his right to first choice. I'd received a phone call after the fact, informing me that my share would be whatever money remained after expenses were deducted from the sale proceeds. "Maybe enough for a nice dinner," he'd said, and I'd heard the smile in his voice. Mom spotted me and waved, the gesture somehow managing to convey both welcome and resignation, as if my arrival was expected but not particularly desired. I made my way through the growing crowd of salegoers, past a woman examining Grandma's cookie jars, past a man flipping through her collection of vintage Life magazines. Each item for sale felt like a small betrayal, pieces of her being scattered to people who'd never known her laugh, or sat in her kitchen eating fresh-baked snickerdoodles, while she told stories about growing up during the Depression. "Gabby," my mother said as I approached, smoothing her hair in that nervous gesture she'd had for as long as I could remember, "we didn't think you'd make it. The traffic from Hartford on a Saturday can be terrible." "I wanted to be here," I replied simply, not taking the bait of her implied criticism. For Grandma, Victor turned from his conversation with Uncle Keith, his expression shifting into what I called his executive face, polite but distant, the look he probably used in boardroom negotiations. "Well, look who decided to show up. I hope you're not expecting us to hold things for you. It's first come, first served. Mrs. Crowley runs a professional operation." "I wasn't expecting anything," I said, keeping my voice level despite the heat rising in my chest. "I just wanted to see the house one more time, and maybe pick up a few small things to remember her by." Uncle Keith clapped Victor on the shoulder with a hearty laugh. "That's our Gabby, always the sentimental one. Victor's been telling us about the probate process. Very complicated. Good thing he knows how to handle these legal matters. We'd all be lost without his expertise." The praise rolled off Victor like water off waxed paint. He accepted it as his due, offering a modest smile that wasn't modest at all. Someone has to take charge in these situations. Father certainly wasn't up to handling all the paperwork, not with his back problems. And Gabby, well, she's got her hands full with those art classes. The dismissal in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. My career, my life, rendered insignificant in a single sentence. Aunt Patricia jumped in with her usual oblivious enthusiasm, patting my arm in a gesture.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
That probably meant to be comforting but felt condescending. "It's wonderful that you work with children, dear. Such a nurturing profession. Not everyone needs to chase big salaries and corner offices. The world needs teachers too." I smiled because it was easier than explaining that I didn't feel lesser for my choices, that I'd never wanted Victor's life of client dinners and performance reviews, that fulfillment couldn't be measured in annual bonuses. They wouldn't understand. They never had. To them, success was quantifiable, displayable, something you could point to at cocktail parties. My successes were quieter: a troubled student learning to express emotions through paint, a classroom transformed into a gallery for parents' night, the thank you note from a mother whose daughter finally felt seen. These things held no currency in my family's economy of worth. The estate sale officially opened at 9, and the trickle of people became a steady stream. I watched strangers flow through Grandma's front door, their feet crossing the threshold she'd swept 10,000 times, their hands touching railings she'd gripped while climbing stairs in her final years. Mrs. Crowley had organized everything with ruthless efficiency. Room by room, every surface held items for sale. The living room furniture wore bright orange tags. The kitchen cabinets stood open, displaying her everyday dishes, her mixing bowls, the cast iron skillet she'd used to make Sunday bacon. Even her bedroom, the intimate space where she'd slept and dreamed, and finally passed away peacefully in her sleep, had been stripped of privacy and turned into a shopping opportunity. I wandered through the house in a daze, my heart fracturing with each step. In the hallway hung photographs that wouldn't be sold, but would likely end up in storage or someone's basement. Grandma, as a young woman in the 1940s, victory rolls in her hair, and hope in her eyes. Grandma and Grandpa on their wedding day, his army uniform crisp, her smile radiant. Grandma, holding baby Victor, then years later holding baby me, the same tender expression on her face in both photos, though my mother liked to claim Victor had always been her favorite. Pictures of holidays, birthdays, graduations, a visual timeline of a life fully lived. The room that hurt most was her sewing room, the small space at the back of the house where she'd spent countless hours at her singer machine, creating quilts and curtains and Halloween costumes. Her fabric stash had been dumped into cardboard boxes, sorted roughly by color, priced at $5 per box. Her button collection, those glass jars filled with every shape and size and color, sat on a table marked $3 each. I picked up one jar, feeling its weight, watching the buttons shift and catch the light, and remembered being 7 years old, sitting on the floor of this very room, sorting buttons by color, while Grandma sewed and told me stories about each one. This green one came from my mother's church dress. This pearl button was from my wedding suit. This red one I found on the street in 1952 and kept because it was too pretty to lose. Gabby? My father's voice pulled me from the memory. You doing okay, sweetheart? I turned to find him in the doorway, concern creasing his weathered face. Dad had always been the gentler parent, caught between my mother's social ambitions and his own simpler desires. He'd worked as an accountant for 40 years, a solid, respectable career that my mother nonetheless considered beneath what she'd hoped for when she'd married him. He looked tired today, older than his 68 years, diminished somehow by the loss of his mother. I'm okay, I lied, setting down the button jar. It's just hard, seeing everything like this. He nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. She loved this room, spent more time here than anywhere else in the house, I think. Your mother wanted to clear it out years ago, turn it into something more useful, but Ma wouldn't hear of it, said a woman needed a space of her own. I smiled despite the ache in my chest. That sounds like Grandma. Victor thinks we should get at least $8,000 for the house. Dad continued, shifting topics in that way he had when emotions got too close to the surface. Maybe more if we're patient. It's a good neighborhood. Young families moving to Riverside for the schools. Someone will want it. The thought of strangers living here, children who weren't me running through these rooms, another family's memories replacing ours, felt like a physical wound. But I just nodded because what else could I do? The house had to be sold. Victor had made the decision, presented it as the only logical option, and our parents had agreed. My vote hadn't been requested. Dad squeezed my shoulder and left me alone with Grandma's fabric and buttons and the ghost of her presence. I stood there for a long moment, then carefully selected one jar of buttons, the one with the green and pearl and red buttons from her stories, and carried it with me as I continued my tour of loss. Outside, the sale had grown crowded. Cars lined both sides of Elmwood Avenue. People carried off purchases, loading boxes into trunks, discussing their finds with the satisfaction of successful hunters. I saw a woman walking away with Grandma's bread box, another with the Afghan Grandma had crocheted while watching evening news. Each departure felt like a small theft, authorized but no less painful. I found myself drifting toward the garage, the one space that seemed less picked over, less interesting to the bargain hunters. The garage had always been Grandpa's domain, and after he'd passed 15 years ago, Grandma had left it largely untouched, a shrine to the man she'd loved for 53 years. His workbench still held tools arranged in careful order, his fishing gear hung on the wall, and in the back corner, covered with a tarp and years of dust, sat stacks of boxes and crates that Mrs. Crowley had apparently deemed too junky even for the main sale. A handwritten sign on a folding chair read, "Free boxes, take what you want. My brother's efficiency at work again. Why bother pricing things that looked worthless when you could just give them away and save the trouble?" I lifted the tarp, coughing as dust billowed up, and began examining the contents. Old magazines, mostly, Popular Mechanics and Reader's Digest from the 60s and 70s, some hand tools too rusty to be useful, a tackle box with a broken latch, several wooden crates with no obvious contents, just weight and the rattle of something shifting inside, and then I saw it. A medium-sized cardboard box, its sides soft with age, the top flaps folded closed but not taped. Someone had written on the side in faded marker, "Maggie's Things Attic." I recognized Grandpa's handwriting, those careful block letters he'd used on everything he labeled. My hands shook slightly as I opened the flaps. Inside was what anyone else would call junk, truly, old notebooks with brittle pages, loose photographs, their edges curled with age, postcards bundled with rotting rubber bands, newspaper clippings yellow and fragile, a few pieces of costume jewelry tangled together, some letters in envelopes with 3-cent stamps, and at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper gone gray with time, something hard and rectangular. I pulled out one of the notebooks and carefully opened it. Grandma's handwriting filled the pages, that elegant script from an era when penmanship mattered. The entries were dated. I realized this was a journal. I read a few lines, my vision blurring with sudden tears. March 15, 1943. James shipped out today. I watched his train leave and felt my heart leave with it. Mother says I must be brave, but how can I be brave when brave means being without him? More notebooks lay beneath, years of her life documented in careful cursive. The photographs were treasures. Grandma as a teenager, her dark hair in rolls, wearing a dress with a white collar. Grandma and friends at what looked like a USO dance, young men in uniform, young women with bright lipstick and brighter smiles. Photos I'd never seen, moments of her life before she became Grandma, when she was just Maggie, a girl navigating war and longing and youth. I was so absorbed in my discovery that I didn't hear Victor approach until he spoke directly behind me, making me jump. Finding anything good in the junk pile, I turned, clutching the box protectively against my chest. Victor stood with his arms crossed, that familiar expression of amused superiority on his face. He'd loosened his tie, but otherwise looked as crisp as he had that morning, untouched by the chaos of the sale. "Just some old papers and photos," I said, my voice coming out more defensive than I'd intended. "Personal things. Grandma's journals." He glanced at the box with disinterest. "Oh, those. Mrs. Crowley found them in the attic. I told her to toss them, but she thought someone might want the old magazines for the covers or something. Vintage advertising, you know, but nobody's touched them." He shrugged. "If you want that stuff, take it, one less thing to haul to the dump." I pulled the box closer, feeling a surge of protectiveness that surprised me with its intensity. "These aren't just old papers, Victor, these are Grandma's journals, her personal writings. Don't you think we should at least look through them before deciding they're garbage?" He checked his watch, a gesture that communicated his impatience more clearly than words ever could. "Gabby, they're notebooks from 70 years ago. What possible use could they be? You want to spend your time reading about what she had for dinner in 1943. He laughed, not unkindly exactly, but with that tone that suggested I was being charmingly naive. Look, if it makes you happy, take the whole box. Take all the boxes back there. I'm serious. Whatever you want from the junk pile is yours. Something in his easy dismissal sparked a contrary impulse in me. I looked back at the dusty corner, at the other boxes and crates still covered by the tarp. How many of them held pieces of Grandma's life that Victor had deemed worthless? How many contained fragments of family history that he'd never bothered to examine before condemning them to the landfill? Actually, I said slowly, I think I'll take several boxes, maybe all of them. Victor's eyebrows rose. You're joking. Gabby, do you have any idea how much space that stuff takes up? Where are you going to put it? Your apartment is what, 800 square feet? I'll figure it out, I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. You said I could have whatever I wanted from back here. I want these boxes. For a moment, something flickered across his face, a calculation happening behind his eyes. Then he shrugged again, already dismissing me and my strange choices. Fine, whatever. Do you need help loading them? I'll manage, I said, perhaps more curtly than necessary. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. Suit yourself, I need to get back anyway. Mrs. Crowley had some questions about the silverware pricing. He started to walk away, then paused and looked back. You know Mom's going to think you've lost it, hauling away boxes of trash, just warning you. After he left, I stood alone in the garage, surrounded by what my family considered refuse, and felt a strange certainty settle over me. I didn't know what all these boxes contained. I didn't know if any of it had value beyond the sentimental, but I knew with absolute conviction that I was meant to take them, that somewhere in these dusty containers lay something important, something that mattered. Call it intuition, or stubbornness, or simply the accumulated weight of being dismissed one too many times, but I was taking these boxes home. I spent the next hour making trips to my car, carrying box after box, crate after crate. My sedan wasn't large, but I made it work, folding down the back seats, stacking carefully, fitting pieces together like a puzzle. The box with Grandma's journals I placed in the front passenger seat, buckled in as if it were a precious cargo that needed protection. People at the sale watched me with curious expressions, this woman in jeans and a cardigan, loading up what looked like garbage while the good stuff was being sold on the lawn. My mother intercepted me on my fourth trip. Gabriella, what on earth are you doing? You're taking all that filthy junk. There's nothing of value back there. We checked. It has value to me, I said, trying to keep my voice pleasant. These are Grandma's things. Her personal items. Mom's lips pressed into a thin line. That expression I knew meant she was weighing whether to push the issue or let it go. Honey, I know you're grieving, but this is bordering on irrational. You can't keep everything. That's hoarding behavior. I'm not keeping everything, I said patiently. I'm keeping the things that nobody else wanted. The things that were going to be thrown away, because they're worthless. She insisted, her voice rising slightly. Victor looked through all of it. If there was anything valuable, don't you think he would have set it aside? The implication hung in the air between us. Victor was smart, successful, capable. Victor would know value when he saw it. Therefore, if Victor had dismissed these items, they must truly be worthless. The logic was circular and infuriating, but I'd learned long ago that arguing with my mother about Victor's judgment was a losing battle. Maybe I just want to remember her differently than everyone else does, I said quietly. Maybe to me, her journals and photographs and personal things matter more than her silver spoons. My mother's expression softened slightly, though concern still creased her forehead. That's very sweet, dear, but where are you going to put all of this? Your apartment is so small, and some of those boxes look like they have mice droppings. You could get sick. I'll be careful, I promised. And I really need to finish loading before it gets dark. She let me go with a sigh that conveyed her opinion more clearly than words. Throughout the rest of the afternoon, I felt eyes on me, family members and strangers alike, watching the odd woman who'd rather have boxes of junk than actual valuables. Aunt Patricia made a comment to Uncle Keith that I wasn't supposed to hear, but did. Always was a strange girl. Remember when she turned down that business internship to volunteer at that summer art camp? Same energy. Victor checked on me once more, asking if I was sure I didn't want him to just rent a dumpster and make this easier on everyone. Even Mrs. Crowley approached to verify that I understood these items were considered refuse and weren't included in any future estate distribution. By 4 o'clock, my car was packed full, boxes filled the entire back area, stacked carefully but precariously. A few crates I'd tied to my roof rack with bungee cords, hoping they'd survive the drive back to Hartford. I'd found 12 boxes total in that garage corner, plus 3 wooden crates, and a small trunk with a broken lock. The trunk had been the heaviest, requiring me to drag it across the concrete floor, and I still didn't know what it contained beyond the rattling sound of many items shifting inside. I took one final walk through the house, now mostly empty, stripped of the items that had made it Grandma's home. The walls showed pale rectangles where pictures had hung. The floors bore indentations from furniture that had sat in the same spots for decades. It looked wounded somehow, exposed and vulnerable. In the kitchen, I stood where her table had been, remembering countless afternoons, sitting there while she baked, her flour-dusted hands moving with practiced efficiency, her voice filling the room with stories and songs and wisdom. My father appeared in the doorway. "You heading out?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. He walked over and pulled me into a hug, something he didn't do often, and I let myself lean into him for just a moment. "She loved you very much, you know. You were special to her." The past tense hurt, the finality of it. "I know. I managed. I loved her too. Your mother's worried about you," he continued, releasing me but keeping one hand on my shoulder. "All those boxes. She thinks maybe you're not processing the grief in a healthy way." "I'm processing it exactly how I need to," I said gently. "Everyone grieves differently, Dad." He nodded slowly. "That's true enough. Just promise me you'll take care of yourself, and if you need anything, if those boxes turn out to be too much, you call me. I'll help you sort through them or dispose of them or whatever you need." I promised, though I had no intention of disposing of anything. We walked out together into the late afternoon light. The sale was winding down. Most of the tables had been cleared. A few stragglers picked through remaining items now marked with handwritten 50% off signs. Victor stood near the porch, talking intensely on his phone, probably something work-related that couldn't wait even for a Saturday. My mother was settling up with Mrs. Crowley, counting cash and checking receipts. I said my goodbyes quickly, not wanting to get pulled into post-sale analysis or face more questions about my choices. Victor gave me a distracted wave, still on his phone. Mom hugged me and reminded me to drive safely with all that weight in my car. Aunt Patricia called out something about seeing me at Thanksgiving. And then I was in my sedan, surrounded by boxes, pulling away from Elmwood Avenue for what might be the last time. The drive back to Hartford felt longer than the morning journey, weighted down literally and figuratively. My car handled sluggishly with all the extra cargo. Every bump and turn made me nervous about the boxes shifting or the crates sliding off the roof, but more than the physical burden, I felt the emotional weight of what I'd done. I'd claimed the refuse of my grandmother's life while my family took the treasures. I'd chosen sentiment over sense, at least by their measures, and I had no idea if I'd made a brilliant decision or a foolish one. Traffic thickened as I approached Hartford, the weekend exodus reversing as people returned from day trips and errands. My apartment building appeared like a haven in the gathering dusk, its brick facade solid and welcoming. I lived on the second floor of a converted three-story house in the West End, a neighborhood of old homes divided into apartments, populated mostly by young professionals and students from the nearby university. My unit was indeed small, as Victor had noted, just a one-bedroom with a living room, galley kitchen, and bathroom. But it was mine, filled with my art and my books and my carefully curated thrift store furniture, and I loved it. The problem became immediately apparent. How was I going to get 12 boxes, 3 crates, and a trunk up a narrow staircase and into an already full apartment? I sat in my car for several minutes, engine off, trying to formulate a plan. My neighbor's light was on. Drew lived in the first-floor unit and worked as a physical therapist. We weren't close friends exactly, but we had that neighborly relationship built on borrowed sugar and held packages and occasional hallway conversations. Maybe he'd help me carry things up. Before I could overthink it, I climbed out and knocked on his door. Drew answered in sweatpants and a faded college t-shirt, clearly settling in for a quiet evening. His golden retriever, Biscuit, immediately pushed past him to greet me with enthusiastic tail wags. "Hey Gabby," Drew said, surprise evident in his voice. "What's up?" I gestured helplessly toward my overloaded car. "I know this is a huge imposition, but I have a lot of heavy boxes that need to go upstairs, and I could really use some help. I'll buy you pizza or beer or whatever you want in exchange." He looked past me at my sedan, which was visibly sagging on its suspension, and his eyebrows rose. "What did you do, rob a library?" "Estate sale," I explained. "My grandmother's things. My family was throwing them away, so I took them." Something in my voice must have conveyed the emotional weight behind those words because his expression shifted from amused to sympathetic. "Say no more, let me grab my shoes." For the next hour we made trips up and down the stairs. Drew was strong, bless him, and didn't complain even when one of the crates turned out to weigh at least 50 pounds. Biscuit supervised from the landing, tail wagging encouragement. My neighbors in the third-floor unit, a young couple I knew only as James and Keiko, saw us struggling and came down to help. Together, we formed an assembly line, passing boxes hand to hand up the stairs, making what would have been impossible for me alone almost easy with communal effort. By 7 o'clock, everything was in my apartment. Boxes lined every wall of my living room. The crates sat stacked in one corner. The trunk occupied the space where my coffee table usually lived, which I'd shoved aside to make room. My apartment looked like a storage unit, barely navigable, but I felt a deep satisfaction looking at it all. I ordered pizza for everyone as promised, and we sat on my floor eating and chatting. Drew asked about my grandmother, and I found myself telling stories, good memories tumbling out. James and Keiko shared about their own grandparents, the small objects they'd kept as remembrances. It was exactly the kind of evening I needed, surrounded by kind people who understood that sometimes things matter not because of their monetary value, but because of the love attached to them. After they left, I stood alone in my transformed apartment, exhausted but not ready to sleep. The box of journals still sat on my counter where I'd placed it first thing. I made a cup of tea, chamomile with honey the way Grandma used to make it, and carefully lifted out the first notebook. The cover was mottled brown, the pages fragile. I opened it to the first entry, dated January 1st, 1942, and began to read. The voice that emerged from those pages was Grandma, but not the Grandma I'd known. This was Maggie, 18 years old, writing with the passionate intensity of youth. She wrote about the war, about boys shipping out and not coming home, about working at a factory making parachutes and feeling proud to contribute. She wrote about my grandfather, James, with such tenderness it made my chest ache. Their courtship unfolded in careful cursive, dances and letters, and stolen kisses and the fear that he'd be sent overseas before they could marry. I read for hours, moving from the first notebook to the second, then the third. Her words painted a vivid picture of life in Riverside during wartime, rationing and victory gardens, and the constant underlying fear. She wrote about marrying James in 1943, a quick ceremony before his deployment. She wrote about the terror of waiting, of every telegram delivery, of the relief when he came home in 1945, missing 2 toes from frostbite but alive, gloriously alive. The notebooks continued through the decades. The birth of my father in 1946, the struggle to afford their first house, James's various jobs, factory work, and then the position at the electric company where he'd stay for 30 years. Maggie's work as a seamstress, taking in alterations and making clothes for neighborhood children. The journals were more than just daily accounting, they were a record of an ordinary life, lived with extraordinary care and attention. But it was in a notebook from 1968 that I found something that made me sit up straighter, tea forgotten and cooling beside me. An entry dated July 14, 1968, written in Maggie's hand, but with an urgency different from her usual measured prose. James bought something today that he's terribly excited about. He won't tell me what it cost, which means too much, but he says it's an investment. Investment in what? I asked. In beauty, he said. In history, he's hidden it away in the garage, like it's treasure, men and their secrets. Though I must admit, the paintings are quite lovely. Paintings, my heart started beating faster. I flipped through the pages looking for more mentions. 3 entries later, James took his paintings to someone at the university. An art professor, he said, wants to know if they're worth what he paid. I told him they're worth something if he loves looking at them, which should be enough, but he's convinced he's found something special. And then, a week after that, the professor confirmed James's suspicion. The paintings are valuable, more valuable than we paid. James is beside himself with pride. He wants to sell them, use the money for a new roof, and maybe a vacation. But I asked him to wait. Something about them feels important, like they're meant to stay with us. He agreed, dear man, though I know the practical side of him thinks I'm being foolish. He built a special crate for them, lined with felt, and put them in the attic where the temperature stays steady. Our secret treasure, he calls it. I set down the notebook with shaking hands. Paintings in a crate in the attic. A crate lined with felt. I looked around my crowded living room at the 3 wooden crates we'd carried up. 2 of them were clearly just old toolboxes, their contents rattling loosely. But the third one, the heavy one that had been hardest to carry, I hadn't opened yet. It sat in the corner, innocuous and silent. I crossed the room and knelt beside it. The wood was old, darkened with age, but solid, rope handles on each end, and when I lifted it slightly, testing its weight, it didn't rattle. The contents inside were packed securely, cushioned somehow. My hands trembled as I found the edge where the lid fit into the frame. It wasn't nailed shut, just fitted tightly. I worked my fingers under the edge and pulled. The lid lifted with a creak of old wood. Inside, I found myself looking at faded blue felt lining, exactly as Grandma had described, and wrapped in layers of cloth, protected and preserved, were 4 rectangular shapes. I carefully lifted out the first one, unwrapping the cloth with delicate fingers, and found myself staring at a painting. It was a landscape, oil on canvas, maybe 16 by 20 inches. The scene showed a riverside village, European in character, with a church spire and stone buildings rendered in loose impressionistic brushstrokes. The colors had held remarkably well, blues and greens, and warm ochres that seemed to glow even in my apartment's dim lighting. The style was distinctive, confident, the work of someone who understood light and composition. In the corner, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it, was a signature. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and typed the signature into a search engine. The results that came back made me gasp aloud. The artist's name appeared on museum websites, in auction records, in articles about American Impressionists of the early 20th century. I clicked on image results and saw paintings that shared the same style, the same confident brushwork, selling at galleries and auction houses for prices that made my vision blur. I carefully unwrapped the other three paintings. Another landscape, this one of a harbor scene. A still life of flowers in a blue vase. And finally, a portrait of a young woman in a white dress, standing by a window, her face turned toward light that seemed to illuminate her from within. Each one bore the same signature. Each one was beautiful, accomplished, the work of a master. My grandfather, plumber and electrician, weekend fisherman and teller of terrible jokes, had somehow found 4 paintings by a listed American Impressionist at what must have been an estate sale or auction in 1968. He'd paid something for them, enough that Grandma wouldn't write the price down. He'd had them authenticated by a university professor. And then, instead of selling them for the practical money they needed, he and Grandma had kept them, wrapped them carefully, and stored them away. I sat on my apartment floor, surrounded by paintings that my family had dismissed as junk, and I started to laugh. It began as a small chuckle, barely audible, but grew until I was laughing so hard tears streamed down my face. The irony was almost too perfect. Victor, with his business degree and his careful calculations, had looked at these crates and seen garbage. Mrs. Crowley, with her professional estate sale experience, had relegated them to the free pile. My entire family had walked past these boxes without a second glance, too focused on the obvious valuables, the silver and jewelry and furniture that screamed their worth. And I, the family disappointment, the art teacher who lived in a tiny apartment and drove an old car, had recognized something they couldn't see. Not because I was smarter or more observant, but because I'd taken the time to look, because I'd valued Grandma's journals enough to read them, because I'd cared about her life beyond what could be sold for profit. The laughter faded into something quieter, a deep sense of rightness settling over me. I understood now why I'd felt so certain about taking these boxes. Some part of me, the part that had spent years looking at art with students, teaching them about brushstrokes and composition, and the way light could transform a canvas, had recognized quality even wrapped in cloth, and hidden in an old crate. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe I just loved Grandma enough to believe that anything she'd kept mattered. I spent the rest of the night carefully examining each painting, taking photographs from multiple angles, documenting every detail. The canvases were in remarkable condition considering their age. A few showed minor crackling in the paint, expected for works probably created in the 1920s or 30s. The frames were simple but well made, wooden with a warm patina that suggested quality. On the back of each canvas, I found additional information. Gallery labels, faded but legible, from a place called the Riverside Art Society. Dates from 1927 and 1928, and on one, a price notation in pencil, $35, which would have been significant money during the Depression. My mind raced with questions. How had these paintings ended up at an estate sale or auction in 1968? Had they belonged to the original purchaser from that Riverside gallery, someone local who'd bought them new and kept them for 40 years? Or had they changed hands multiple times, their value forgotten or unknown? And how had Grandpa, a working-class man without art education, recognized what he was looking at? I pulled out my laptop and began serious research. The artist's name led me down a rabbit hole of art history. He'd been part of the American Impressionist movement, trained in Paris, exhibited widely in the 1920s. His work was represented in several major museums, but he died young, only 42, in 1931, which limited his total output and made his paintings particularly valuable to collectors. The auction records I found showed his work selling anywhere from $15,000 for small sketches to over $200,000 for major canvases. My paintings weren't his masterworks. They were smaller, probably done quickly, what art historians might call cabinet pictures, meant for domestic display rather than museum walls. But they were authentic, signed, documented with gallery provenance, and in excellent condition. Even at the conservative end of valuation, I was looking at significant value, possibly life-changing value. I should have felt elated. Instead, I felt strangely calm, as if I'd known all along that something important hid in those boxes. I made myself stop researching and start thinking practically. These paintings needed proper evaluation by an expert, someone who could authenticate them definitively and provide accurate appraisal. They needed to be insured immediately, and I needed to decide what to tell my family and when. The thought of my family brought a complicated swirl of emotions. Part of me wanted to call Victor right that moment, to hear the shock in his voice when I explained what he'd dismissed as garbage. Part of me wanted to say nothing, to keep this discovery private, to protect it from their judgment and their inevitable attempts to claim a share. But the practical part of me knew I'd have to tell them eventually. These paintings had been Grandma's, part of her estate, and even though Victor had literally given them away, had told me to take whatever I wanted from the junk pile, there would be questions about ownership and inheritance. I wrapped the paintings carefully back in their cloths and returned them to the felt-lined crate. Tomorrow I would figure out next steps, find an appraiser, start the authentication process. Tonight I needed sleep, though I doubted I'd get much with my mind spinning like this. But first, I sent a text to my husband Owen. I'd been so absorbed in the estate sale and the discovery that I'd barely thought about him all day, which made me feel guilty. Owen taught at the University of Connecticut, medieval history primarily, but his real passion was antiques and historical artifacts. We'd met 3 years ago at an estate auction, both bidding on a Victorian writing desk that he'd ultimately won. He'd bought me coffee as consolation. We'd talked for 4 hours about our shared love of old things and the stories they carried, and I'd known before that first date ended that I was going to marry him. He was in Boston this weekend at an academic conference, presenting a paper on trade routes in 14th century England, which was why he hadn't come to the estate sale with me. But I needed to tell him what I'd found, needed his steady presence even if just through text. I typed, "You're not going to believe what was in Grandma's garage. Call me when you can. I'm fine, everyone's fine, but I found something incredible." His response came almost immediately. "In a session but breaking out now, 5 minutes." I used those 5 minutes to make fresh tea and try to organize my thoughts into something coherent. When my phone rang, I answered before the first ring finished. Owen's voice came through warm and familiar, tinged with curiosity and concern. "Okay, you have my complete attention. What did you find?" I told him everything, starting with Victor's dismissal of the boxes, the journals, the entry about paintings, the crate in my living room, the discovery of 4 signed works by a listed American impressionist. The words tumbled out in a rush, probably incoherent, but Owen listened without interrupting, making small sounds of acknowledgement that meant he was following along. When I finished, silence stretched for a moment, then Owen laughed, a delighted sound that made me smile. "Gabby, do you realize what you've done? You've made possibly the best estate sale find I've ever heard of outside of television shows. 4 paintings by a known artist, authenticated provenance, excellent condition, discovered in a box marked free. This is extraordinary." "I know," I said, relief flooding through me at his enthusiasm. "But Owen, what do I do? I need an appraiser, but I don't know who to trust. and I have to tell my family eventually. But Victor literally gave these away. He told me to take whatever I wanted from the junk pile. Does that mean they're legally mine? Slow down, Owen said gently. First, yes, if he gave you explicit permission to take items he'd designated as refuse, those items are yours. You might want to document that somehow, get it in writing if possible, but from a legal standpoint, you're almost certainly clear. Second, for authentication and appraisal, I know someone perfect, Dr. Helena Westfield. She's based in New Haven, specializes in American art from that period, and she's absolutely trustworthy. I've worked with her on several estate evaluations. I'll text you her contact information. Should I tell my family now or wait until after the appraisal? I asked the question that had been nagging at me. Owen was quiet for a moment, considering. That's entirely your decision, love. But if I were you, I'd wait. Get the paintings properly authenticated and appraised first. Make sure you have all the documentation in order. Then you can present it to your family as a fait accompli, rather than a possibility. It will be harder for anyone to argue or try to claim a share if you have expert validation backing your ownership. His advice made sense, and it aligned with my own instincts. You're right. I'll wait. When do you get back from Boston? Tomorrow evening. My last session is at 3, then I'm driving straight home. I should be there by 7 or 8 depending on traffic. Can you survive until then without doing anything impulsive? I laughed despite my exhaustion. I promise to contain my impulses. I love you. I love you too. And Gabby, I'm so proud of you. You honored your grandmother's memory by caring about her things, and you found treasure because you were willing to look where no one else would. That's not luck. That's character. After we hung up, I sat holding my phone, his words warming me from the inside out. Owen understood in a way my family never had that value wasn't always obvious, that worth could hide in unexpected places, that sometimes the most important thing was simply paying attention. I finally went to bed around 2 in the morning, but sleep came fitfully. My mind kept replaying the day, Victor's dismissive voice, the weight of the crates, the moment of unwrapping that first painting and seeing the brushstrokes catch the light. And underneath all of it, a growing awareness that this discovery was going to change something fundamental in my family dynamics. I'd been the overlooked one, the art teacher's sister who made modest money and lived a small life. But now I had something they wanted, or would want once they understood what it was. The power balance we'd maintained for 34 years was about to shift, and I had no idea what that would look like. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of October weather that made staying inside feel virtuous rather than lazy. I woke with the sun, which wasn't much of a sun at all, just a pale disk behind clouds. My living room looked even more chaotic in daylight, boxes everywhere, barely space to walk. But my eyes went immediately to the crate in the corner, confirming that last night hadn't been a dream. I made coffee and toast, then settled at my small kitchen table with my laptop, and began the work of documentation. I created a detailed spreadsheet listing every item I'd taken from the estate sale, where I'd found it, and what condition it was in. For the paintings, I included dimensions, signatures, dates, the gallery labels, everything. I photographed the journal entry where Grandma had written about James buying paintings. I even found the receipt from Mrs. Crowley, which listed items sold during the estate sale, but also had a notation at the bottom: garage materials offered free to family, taken by G. Norton. It wasn't a legal contract, but it was documentation that I'd taken these items with permission, and that they'd been designated as having no value by the estate sale organizer. Combined with Victor's verbal permission, which I'd heard in front of the open garage, I felt reasonably confident about my legal standing. Next, I emailed Dr. Helena Westfield using the contact information Owen had sent. I kept the message professional but warm, explaining that I was Owen Mitchell's wife, that I'd discovered what appeared to be 4 paintings by the artist in question, and that I needed expert authentication and appraisal. I attached several photos of the best painting, the portrait of the young woman, showing both the full canvas and close-ups of the signature and gallery label. I hit send and tried not to obsess about when she might respond. It was Sunday morning, she probably wasn't checking email. I'd hear back Monday at the earliest, maybe not until later in the week. I needed to occupy myself with something else, or I'd drive myself crazy refreshing my inbox. The journals provided the perfect distraction. I pulled out the next notebook in the chronological sequence, dated 1952, and lost myself in Grandma's words. She wrote about my father as a child, his first day of school, his fascination with numbers and patterns that would eventually lead him to accounting. She wrote about the neighborhood, families moving in and out, children growing up, the rhythms of suburban life in the 1950s. Her voice on the page was so vivid I could almost hear her speaking, that slight Connecticut accent, the way she'd pause to collect her thoughts before saying something important. Around noon, my phone buzzed with an email notification. Dr. Helena Westfield had responded, and on a Sunday no less. Her message was brief but excited. "Mrs. Mitchell, thank you for reaching out. Based on the photographs you sent, I believe you may indeed have an authentic work by this artist. The signature appears correct, and the style is consistent with his known pieces from that period. I would very much like to examine these paintings in person. Would you be available to bring them to my office in New Haven this week? I've CC'd my assistant who can help schedule an appointment." My heart raced reading her words. She thought they were real. An expert in American art from this period thought they were authentic based on photographs alone. I immediately replied, saying I could come any day this week, at whatever time worked for her schedule. Within 20 minutes, her assistant had responded offering Tuesday at 10 in the morning. I accepted before I could second-guess myself. Tuesday was only 2 days away. 2 days until I'd know for certain what I had, what they were worth, what this meant for my life. The waiting felt impossible, time stretching out like taffy. I forced myself to be productive, spending Sunday afternoon, carefully going through the other boxes I'd taken. Most contained exactly what they'd appeared to contain: old magazines, rusty tools, fishing gear, random household items that Grandpa had saved for reasons lost to time. But I found treasures nonetheless, treasures of sentiment if not value. One box held all of my childhood artwork that I'd made at Grandma's house: crayon drawings from age 4, watercolors from age 8, the pottery bowl I'd made at age 12 with my handprint pressed into the clay. She'd kept everything, every piece I'd ever given her, carefully stored in chronological order. I sat on my floor crying as I flipped through construction paper cards and finger paintings, seeing my younger self through her eyes, seeing how she'd valued my art, even when my own parents had treated it as a phase I'd grow out of. Another box contained photographs, hundreds of them, organized roughly by decade. Photos of family gatherings, holidays, birthdays, everyday moments that someone had deemed worth capturing on film. I found pictures of myself I'd never seen, candid shots where I was laughing or concentrating on some task, looking genuinely happy in a way I rarely appeared in the formal family portraits my mother preferred. Grandma had seen me, really seen me, and these photographs were proof. The trunk, which I'd saved for last, turned out to contain fabric, bolts and pieces of beautiful cloth that Grandma must have collected over decades, silk that shimmered even in the dim light of my apartment, velvet in deep jewel tones, cotton printed with flowers and geometric patterns, linen in natural shades of cream and beige. Some pieces were clearly vintage, probably from the 1940s and 50s, based on the designs. Others were more recent, All of it was carefully folded and stored with sachets of lavender to keep it fresh. As an art teacher who sometimes did textile projects with students, I recognized the value here too, though nothing like the paintings. Vintage fabric in good condition had a market among quilters, costumers, and crafters. But more than that, this was Grandma's collection, evidence of her life as a seamstress and her eye for color and pattern. Each piece told a story: a dress she'd planned to make, a quilt she'd considered, possibilities that had remained just that, possibilities. By Sunday evening, I'd sorted through everything. I'd created organized piles, items to keep for sentimental value, items to donate, items that might have resale value worth researching. The paintings stood apart from all of it, literally and figuratively, waiting in their crate for Tuesday's appointment. Owen called that evening from a rest stop somewhere in Connecticut, still an hour from home. I gave him a full update: the appointment with Dr. Westfield, the other treasures I'd found in the boxes. He listened with the patient attention that was one of the qualities I loved most about him, never rushing me, asking thoughtful questions, understanding why the childhood artwork mattered as much as the valuable paintings. When I finally saw him, standing in my doorway with his conference bag slung over one shoulder, and that slightly rumpled look he got after long days of academic presentations, relief washed over me. I hadn't realized how much I'd needed his physical presence until he was there, solid and real. He pulled me into a hug that smelled like coffee and his familiar soap, and for the first time since Friday, I felt completely grounded. After I'd fed him leftover pasta, and he'd changed into comfortable clothes, we sat on the floor of my living room and I showed him everything. The journals first, reading him some of Grandma's entries, watching his face as he absorbed her words. Then the childhood artwork, the photographs, the vintage fabrics, and finally, with a sense of ceremony, I opened the crate and unwrapped the paintings one by one. Owen's reaction was everything I'd hoped for. He examined each canvas with the careful attention of someone who understood art and history, turning them to catch different light, studying the brushwork, reading the gallery labels. When he looked up at me, his eyes were bright with excitement. "Gabby, these are museum quality. I'm not an expert in American Impressionism, but I've seen enough art to recognize accomplished work. The composition, the use of light, the confident brushstrokes. These are the work of a master." We spent the rest of the evening researching together, finding more information about the artist, his life, his career, his tragic early death. We looked at auction records and gallery sales, trying to establish a reasonable value range for paintings of this size and period. Every new piece of information confirmed what we'd already suspected. I'd found something extraordinary. Monday crawled by with painful slowness. I'd taken personal days from school for Monday and Tuesday, telling my principal I needed time to handle my grandmother's estate. It wasn't a lie, just not the complete truth. I used Monday to prepare for the appointment with Dr. Westfield, carefully rewrapping each painting in clean cloth, placing them in the crate with additional padding, making sure they'd travel safely. I also called my insurance company and added a rider to my renter's policy for valuable artwork. The agent asked questions about provenance and value that I couldn't fully answer yet, but we agreed on temporary coverage based on my description and the research I'd done. It felt surreal, discussing insurance for paintings that 48 hours ago had been considered trash. Monday evening, I got a phone call from my mother. I almost didn't answer, seeing her name on my screen and feeling a surge of anxiety about what she might ask or say. But avoiding her would only make things worse, so I picked up. "Gabriella, I'm calling to check on you," she said without preamble. "You left so quickly on Saturday and you were hauling all those filthy boxes. Did you even get them all in your apartment? I'm worried you've created a fire hazard with all that old paper and wood." I bit back my first response and kept my voice neutral. "Everything's fine, Mom. I got them all upstairs safely. and I've been going through them. There's actually some really interesting stuff. Family photos and Grandma's journals. Journals. She sounded surprised. Mother kept journals. I had no idea. What does she write about? Everything. Daily life, family, her thoughts about things. It's like getting to know her as a person beyond just being our grandmother. I paused, weighing how much to say. She wrote about you and Dad's wedding, about how proud she was when Dad started his accounting firm. My mother's voice softened. She was proud of your father, worried about him too, starting a business during a recession. But proud, a pause. Is there anything in those journals about me? The vulnerability in her question caught me off guard. My mother rarely showed uncertainty, and hearing it now reminded me that she was grieving too, that she'd lost her mother-in-law who she'd known for over 40 years. I haven't read everything yet, I said honestly. But yes, she writes about you, about what a good mother you were, how organized, how you kept everything running smoothly. I'd like to read them someday, she said quietly. When you're done with them, of course, I promised. I'll make copies of the important parts. These are family history. Everyone should have access. We talked for a few more minutes, the conversation easier than I'd expected. She didn't mention the paintings because she didn't know they existed. Nobody knew except Owen, and now Dr. Westfield. The secret sat between us on the phone line, invisible but significant, and I felt a twinge of guilt for not telling her. But Owen's advice echoed in my mind. Wait until you have authentication and appraisal. Wait until you have all the facts. After we hung up, I sat looking at my phone, thinking about family and secrets and the way information could shift relationships. Once I told them about the paintings, everything would change. My mother would likely feel conflicted, glad I'd found something valuable but uncomfortable that I'd found it by taking what they'd considered garbage. Victor would be angry at himself for missing it, and that anger might redirect toward me. My father would probably just be quietly pleased that something good had come from his mother's estate. Tuesday morning arrived clear and cold, the kind of autumn day where the sky looked impossibly blue, and every leaf seemed to glow with color. I woke before my alarm, nerves and excitement making sleep impossible. Owen had offered to come with me to New Haven, but he had 2 classes he couldn't cancel, so I'd be making the drive alone. Part of me was grateful for that. This felt like something I needed to do myself, the culmination of a journey that had started with being dismissed by my family and ended with discovering treasure in what they'd thrown away. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that felt professional but comfortable, dark jeans, a navy sweater, my good boots. I wanted to be taken seriously, to present myself as someone who understood what she had and deserved respect. Owen made me breakfast, while I triple-checked that I had everything I needed, the crate with the paintings, my folder of documentation, including copies of the journal entries and the estate sale receipt, my phone fully charged, the address for Dr. Westfield's office programmed into my GPS. The drive to New Haven took just under an hour, traffic light on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Westfield's office was located near Yale's campus in a historic brick building that housed several art galleries and consulting firms. I found parking on a side street and sat in my car for a moment, gathering my courage. This was it. In the next hour or two, I'd know definitively what I had, what it was worth, what it meant. The uncertainty would end, and reality would begin, whatever that reality turned out to be. I carried the crate carefully up the stairs to the 2nd floor, following signs to Westfield Art Authentication and Appraisal. The office door was painted deep green with gold lettering, professional and elegant. I balanced the crate on one hip and knocked. The woman who opened the door was probably in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp eyes behind stylish glasses. She wore a gray dress that looked expensive, and simple jewelry that suggested confidence rather than ostentation. Her smile was warm and genuine as she extended her hand. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Helena Westfield. Please come in." The office was exactly what I'd hoped for, lined with bookshelves full of art reference volumes, the walls covered with framed paintings and photographs. A large desk sat near the window, but most of the space was taken up by examination tables, with special lighting and equipment I didn't recognize. Everything spoke of expertise and care, someone who took art seriously and treated it with the respect it deserved. Dr. Westfield helped me set the crate on one of the examination tables, then gestured to a comfortable chair. Before we look at the paintings, tell me the story of how you found them. Context matters in authentication, and I'm curious about the provenance. I told her everything, starting with Grandma's estate sale and Victor's dismissal of the boxes, the journals and the entry about James buying paintings, finding the crate in my living room and unwrapping them one by one. She listened intently, occasionally making notes, her expression growing more animated as the story unfolded. "What a remarkable find," she said when I finished. "And what incredible foresight your grandfather had both in recognizing quality and in preserving them so carefully. That felt lining probably saved these paintings from temperature fluctuations and humidity damage that would have degraded them significantly." She stood and pulled on a pair of white cotton gloves. "Now let's see what you've brought me." I watched as she carefully removed the first painting from the crate and unwrapped it with movements that spoke of years of practice. She placed it on the examination table under a bright light and began her examination, using a magnifying glass to study the signature, the brush strokes, the canvas weave. She checked the back of the painting, examining the gallery label with particular attention. Then she moved to a different light source, something that made the paint glow in strange ways, and studied the surface again. The process was repeated with each painting, methodical and thorough. She took photographs with professional equipment, made notes on a tablet, occasionally murmured to herself in what sounded like approval. I sat trying to stay calm, but my heart raced and my hands kept fidgeting in my lap until I forced them to be still. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes, Dr. Westfield turned to me with a smile that transformed her serious face into something almost gleeful. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm delighted to tell you that all 4 of these paintings are authentic works by this artist. The signatures are correct, the brushwork is consistent with his known technique, the canvas and paint are period appropriate, and the gallery provenance is legitimate. I recognize the Riverside Art Society. They were a small but reputable gallery that operated from 1925 to 1932, and they represented several important American impressionists of that era." Relief and excitement flooded through me in equal measure. "They're real, they're actually real, very real," she confirmed, "and quite valuable. Now let me discuss each piece individually, so you understand what you have." She gestured to the first painting, the Riverside village scene. "This is typical of his landscape work from the late 1920s. Good composition, skilled handling of light, but not one of his major pieces. In the current market, I'd appraise this between $18,000 and $25,000. My breath caught. That single painting was worth more than I made in half a year of teaching." She moved to the harbor scene, similar quality and period. Possibly slightly more valuable, due to the subject matter. Maritime scenes by this artist are particularly sought after by collectors. I'd estimate 22 to 30,000. The still life was next, the flowers in the blue vase. Still lifes were less common in his body of work, which makes this somewhat more desirable to collectors looking to round out their holdings. The color work here is exceptional, particularly the way he's captured the translucency of the petals. 25 to 35,000. And finally she turned to the portrait of the young woman in white. "This is the gem of your collection. Portrait work by this artist is rare, and this is an absolutely lovely example. The model's identity is unknown, which is unfortunate from a historical standpoint, but doesn't significantly impact value." The technical skill on display here, the way he's rendered the fabric of her dress and particularly the light falling across her face, this is masterful work. At auction, I would expect this painting to bring between $55,000 and $75,000, possibly more if you had the right buyers competing. I did rapid math in my head. Even at the conservative end of her estimates, I was looking at over $120,000. At the high end, potentially $165,000, life-changing money, money that could pay off my student loans, give me a financial cushion I'd never had, open possibilities I'd stopped letting myself imagine. Dr. Westfield was still talking, explaining market conditions and auction houses versus private sales, but I'd stopped fully processing her words. The reality was hitting me in waves. I'd found over $100,000 worth of art in boxes my family had designated as trash. I'd trusted my instincts and my love for Grandma enough to take what no one else wanted, and I'd discovered treasure. "Are you all right, Mrs. Mitchell?" Dr. Westfield's concerned voice broke through my daze. "This can be overwhelming, I know. Why don't I get you some water?" I nodded, accepting the glass she brought me from a small refrigerator in the corner. The cold water helped ground me, brought me back to the present moment. "I'm okay, just processing. This is more than I imagined. It's a significant find," she agreed. "Now we need to discuss next steps. You have several options for how to proceed with these paintings. You could sell them at auction, which would likely bring top dollar, but involves fees and waiting for the right sale. You could sell them privately, which might be faster and involve lower fees, but potentially lower prices. Or you could keep them, insure them properly, and enjoy them as both art and investment that will likely appreciate over time." We spent the next hour discussing practicalities. She explained the authentication process she'd completed, and would formalize in a written report, including chemical analysis of the paint, to confirm period-appropriate materials, and comparison with known works in museum databases. She gave me names of reputable auction houses and art dealers, who specialized in American Impressionism. She provided insurance recommendations and suggestions for climate-controlled storage if I decided not to keep the paintings in my apartment. By the time I left her office, carrying the crate of now authenticated paintings, and a folder thick with documentation, my head was spinning with information and possibilities. But underneath all the practical considerations, one thought kept repeating: I have to tell my family. The drive back to Hartford felt surreal, as if I were floating slightly above my own life, watching it unfold from a distance. I'd entered Dr. Westfield's office with hope, and left with certainty. The paintings were real, they were valuable, they were mine, and now I had to figure out how to share this information with people who had dismissed everything I'd taken as worthless junk. I called Owen from the car, using the hands-free system, and told him everything Dr. Westfield had said. His whoop of excitement made me laugh, the first genuine laugh since leaving New Haven. "Gabby, this is incredible. I'm so proud of you, and vindicated in my belief that your instincts about art are excellent." "I got lucky," I protested. "You got observant," he corrected. "You paid attention when no one else did. That's not luck, that's skill. So, what's next? When are you telling your family?" That was the question I'd been avoiding thinking about too directly. I need to, obviously, but Owen, I'm dreading it. Victor is going to lose his mind when he realizes what he gave away, and my mother will have opinions about what I should do with the money, and everyone will suddenly care very much about these paintings they walked past without a glance. "You're not required to tell them immediately," Owen said gently. "Take a few days, process this yourself first. Decide what you want to do with the paintings, what you want to say to your family. You're in control of this narrative, Gabby. Don't let anyone take that away from you." His words steadied me. He was right. I didn't owe anyone an immediate announcement. I could take time to think, to plan, to prepare myself for the inevitable family drama. Okay, I'll wait until this weekend. Maybe I'll invite everyone to our apartment, tell them all at once. That way I only have to go through it once. That sounds like a good plan. I'll be right there with you, backup and support, we're a team. We talked for a few more minutes, mundane things about dinner plans and his afternoon classes, normal life continuing even as mine was transforming. After we hung up, I drove the rest of the way home in contemplative silence, watching the familiar landscape of Connecticut roll past, thinking about Grandma and Grandpa and the paintings they'd kept secret for decades. Back in my apartment, I carefully returned the paintings to their crate and placed it in my bedroom closet, the safest spot I could think of. The rest of my living room was still crowded with boxes, but now they looked different to me. Not just junk or sentimental items, but possibilities. What else might be hidden in these containers that I hadn't yet discovered? What other treasures had my family overlooked? I spent the rest of Tuesday afternoon continuing to sort through boxes, but with renewed attention to detail. I examined every photograph, read every letter, checked every item carefully before deciding its fate. I found more treasures, though nothing with the monetary value of the paintings. A complete set of vintage postcards from the 1930s showing scenes from around Connecticut, a collection of wartime rationing stamps, carefully preserved in an album, handwritten recipes in Grandma's mother's writing, passed down through generations. Each discovery felt significant, proof that the people I'd come from had valued things beyond money, had understood that history and memory mattered. Wednesday I returned to work, grateful for the distraction of lesson plans and second graders with paint-covered fingers. Teaching required my full attention, left no room for obsessing about paintings or family drama. My students were working on self-portraits, and I found myself looking at their work with fresh eyes, seeing the courage it took to put yourself on paper, to declare through art that you existed and mattered. During lunch, I sat in the teacher's lounge and drafted a text message to my family. I'd like to have everyone over to our apartment this Saturday at 2. There's something important I need to share about Grandma's estate. Please let me know if you can make it. I read it over several times, changing words, trying to strike the right tone. Finally, I sent it before I could second-guess myself anymore. The responses came quickly. My mother, "Of course, dear. Is everything all right? Victor, can't it wait until Thanksgiving? Saturdays are busy." My father, "We'll be there, sweetheart." Aunt Patricia and Uncle Keith both confirmed they could come. Victor eventually agreed, after my mother apparently called him and insisted because his second text said, "Fine, 2 p.m. Saturday. This better be important." I responded to all of them with variations of "see you then," refusing to give any hints about my news. Let them wonder, let them worry that maybe there was a problem with the estate settlement, or that I'd found something concerning in Grandma's papers. Let them arrive Saturday with no idea that their assumptions about me and my choices were about to be completely upended. Thursday and Friday crawled by with the kind of slowness that comes from anticipating something both exciting and terrifying. I cleaned my apartment obsessively, moving the boxes to my bedroom to make space for people to sit. Owen and I shopped for refreshments, cheese and crackers and wine, making it a proper gathering rather than just announcement. I practiced what I'd say, standing in front of my bathroom mirror delivering various versions of the news, trying to find words that wouldn't sound either apologetic or triumphant. Friday evening, Owen found me pacing our living room for the 100th time and pulled me into a hug. "You're going to be amazing tomorrow. You're going to tell them the truth. They're going to react however they react, and then it will be done. No more secrets, no more anxiety about when to tell them, just done. What if Victor tries to claim the paintings? The fear I'd been suppressing finally voiced. What if he says I took them under false pretenses, or that they should be divided among all of us? Then he'll be wrong. Owen said firmly, you have documentation that he gave you explicit permission to take items from the garage, items that were designated as refuse. You have witnesses who heard him say you could take whatever you wanted, and legally, once he gave those items away, they became yours. He can be angry all he wants, but he has no claim. Intellectually, I knew he was right, but emotionally, I was preparing myself for conflict, for accusations, for family members who would suddenly be very interested in my inheritance now that it had value. The little girl in me who'd spent years being compared unfavorably to her brother, who'd heard countless times that her choices were impractical, who'd absorbed the message that she wasn't quite good enough, that girl was scared, but the adult I'd become, the woman who'd followed her instincts and found treasure, she was ready. Saturday morning I woke early and went for a run, burning off nervous energy. The autumn air was crisp and clean, leaves crunching under my feet, and the physical exertion helped quiet my racing thoughts. Back home, I showered and dressed in clothes that felt like armor, dark pants and a burgundy sweater that Grandma had always said brought out my eyes. I arranged the cheese and crackers, set out wine glasses and napkins, made everything look welcoming even though my stomach was in knots. Owen moved through the apartment with calm efficiency, helping with final preparations, offering quiet reassurance. At 1:45, he squeezed my hand and said, "Whatever happens in the next few hours, remember that you did nothing wrong. You honored your grandmother, you trusted yourself, and you found something extraordinary. That's the story here. Don't let anyone rewrite it." The first knock came at precisely 2 o'clock. My parents, always punctual, stood in the hallway with a bottle of wine and uncertain expressions. My mother hugged me perhaps a beat longer than usual, and I realized she was genuinely worried about what I might tell them. Behind them came Aunt Patricia and Uncle Keith, then finally Victor, who arrived 10 minutes late in what I suspected was a power play, making everyone wait for him. Once they were all settled with drinks and appetizers, an awkward silence fell over the room. 7 people crammed into my small living space, sitting on my thrift store couch and mismatched chairs, waiting for me to speak. Victor checked his phone. My mother smoothed her skirt. The moment stretched out until I couldn't postpone any longer. I stood, and all eyes turned to me. "Thank you for coming. I know you're all curious about why I asked you here, so I'll get right to it." I took a breath. "You all know that I took several boxes from Grandma's garage at the estate sale, things that were going to be thrown away. Victor gave me permission to take whatever I wanted from what he called the junk pile." Victor shifted uncomfortably, clearly not liking being reminded of that characterization. I continued, my voice gaining strength. "I spent the last week going through those boxes carefully. I found family photographs, Grandma's journals from across her entire adult life, vintage fabrics from her sewing collection, and other personal items, things that have tremendous sentimental value, at least to me." My mother leaned forward. "That's wonderful, dear. We'd love to see the journals sometime." "You will," I promised. "But that's not the main thing I needed to tell you. In one of the boxes, I found references to something that Grandpa had purchased in 1968, paintings. He'd bought them at an estate sale or auction, had them authenticated by a professor at the university, and then he and Grandma decided to keep them rather than sell them. They wrapped them carefully and stored them in a wooden crate in the attic." Understanding was starting to dawn on Victor's face, and it wasn't pleasant. "Wait, are you saying you found valuable paintings in the stuff from the garage?" "I'm saying I found 4 paintings by a well-known American impressionist from the 1920s. I had them authenticated this week by Dr. Helena Westfield, an expert in American art from that period. She confirmed they're genuine, with solid provenance from a legitimate gallery, in excellent condition. I paused, meeting Victor's eyes directly. Based on current market values, the four paintings together are worth between $120,000 and $165,000. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father's eyes widened in shock. Uncle Keith let out a low whistle. Aunt Patricia gasped audibly, and Victor's face went through several colors, settling on a mottled red that suggested either rage or a stroke in progress. "That's impossible," he finally said, his voice tight. "I looked through all that stuff personally." Mrs. Crawley examined everything. There were no valuable paintings. They were wrapped in cloth inside a wooden crate. I explained calmly. The crate was heavy and didn't rattle, so nobody opened it. It was easier to assume it was tools or junk, and designate it for the free pile. "You can't just keep them," Victor said, standing abruptly. "Those paintings were part of Grandma's estate. They should have been included in the formal inventory, and divided according to the will." Owen spoke up for the first time, his voice calm but firm. "Actually, Victor, you gave Gabby explicit permission to take items from the garage that you designated as refuse. We have documentation of that, including the estate sale receipt, that notes garage materials were offered free to family and taken by G. Norton. Once you gave those items away, they legally became Gabby's property." "That's ridiculous," Victor sputtered. "She knew what she was looking for. She found references in those journals and came specifically to take the paintings. That's deceptive. I didn't know anything when I took the boxes," I said, my voice sharp now. "I took them because they were Grandma's personal things, and I wanted to honor her memory. I found the reference to paintings while reading her journals days later, and even then, I didn't know if they still existed, or what condition they'd be in, or whether they had any value. I took a box you called junk, and discovered it contained treasure. That's not deception, Victor, that's paying attention." My father cleared his throat, drawing everyone's focus. "Hold on, everyone. Let's take a breath here." He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Gabby, sweetheart, walk us through this again. You took boxes from the garage with Victor's knowledge and permission?" "Yes. He told me I could take whatever I wanted from the junk pile. His exact words were something like, 'Take all the boxes back there, if it makes you happy.' And you didn't know about any paintings at that point?" "I had no idea. I took the boxes because they contained Grandma's personal writings and family photos. I only learned about paintings when I read her journal entry from 1968. My father nodded slowly. "And you had these paintings authenticated by an expert?" "Yes, Dr. Helena Westfield, in New Haven. She's a recognized expert in American Impressionism. I can show you her written authentication report." He was quiet for a moment, processing, then he looked at Victor. "Son, I love you, but you can't unring this bell. You told your sister she could have those items. You designated them as worthless. The fact that they turned out to have value doesn't change that you gave them away." "Dad, she manipulated the situation," Victor protested. "No," my father said firmly. "She valued things you didn't. She took time to look carefully at what everyone else dismissed. That's not manipulation. That's diligence." My mother spoke up, her voice careful. "Gabriella, what are you planning to do with the paintings?" It was the question I'd been expecting, and I'd prepared my answer. "I haven't decided yet. I might sell some and keep others. I might keep them all. The point is, they're mine to decide about. They were given to me. I found them. I had them authenticated. What I choose to do with them is my business." "But family should share," Aunt Patricia said, her voice plaintive. These are family heirlooms. Family heirlooms that nobody wanted, I reminded her. Victor organized an estate sale where Grandma's entire life was sold off to strangers. He didn't ask if I wanted any of the furniture, or the jewelry, or the silver. He took what he wanted, let Mom and Dad take what they wanted, and I got informed after the fact. The only reason I have these paintings is because they were mixed in with things everyone considered worthless. Victor was pacing now, his hands clenched at his sides, the veins in his neck standing out in a way that would have been concerning if I wasn't so focused on holding my ground. This is unbelievable. You know what those paintings are worth now, Gabby? You can't seriously think you're entitled to keep all of that value for yourself. It's selfish. The word hung in the air like a slap. Selfish. I'd been called many things by my family over the years. Impractical, idealistic, overly sentimental, but selfish was new, and it stung precisely because it was so unfair. I felt Owen tense beside me, ready to jump to my defense, but I placed a hand on his arm. This was my fight. Selfish, I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. Let me make sure I understand, Victor. When you took Grandma's jewelry without asking if anyone else wanted any pieces, that wasn't selfish. When you claimed the silver service and the antique furniture for your house, that wasn't selfish. When you organized this entire estate sale on a timeline that suited you, pricing items without consulting anyone, keeping the valuable things for yourself and our parents, that wasn't selfish. But me keeping paintings that you literally threw away, that's where we draw the line on selfishness. My mother made a small sound of protest. Gabriella, that's not fair. Victor was executor of the estate. He had responsibilities. He had authority, I corrected, and he used it to benefit himself, which is fine. That's his legal right as executor. But now he's angry because I found value where he saw none, and he wants to rewrite the rules retroactively to include himself in my discovery. That's not how this works. Uncle Keith, who'd been silent until now, spoke up in his jovial way that always felt like he was trying to smooth over conflict. Now, we're all family here. Surely there's a way to make everyone happy. Gabby, what if you sold the paintings and shared the proceeds? That seems fair. Fair. The word tasted bitter. Uncle Keith, let me ask you something. At the estate sale, did you buy anything from Grandma's house? He looked confused by the question. Well, yes. I got that nice tool set from the garage and a few books. And did you offer to share those with me or split the cost? No, but that was only a few $100s worth of stuff. Exactly. It was only worth a few $100s, so it didn't occur to you to share. But my discovery is worth more. So suddenly sharing becomes important. The principle you're suggesting only applies when the stakes are high enough to matter to you. Aunt Patricia jumped in, her voice taking on that wheedling quality that had always set my teeth on edge. Gabriella, dear, you have to understand how this looks. Your brother worked so hard to manage the estate, to organize everything, to handle all the legal matters, and now you swoop in and take the most valuable items he didn't even know existed. Can't you see how that feels unfair to him? I turned to face her fully. What I see, Aunt Patricia, is that Victor made assumptions. He assumed that because something looked like junk, it was junk. He assumed that because I'm not a businesswoman or a lawyer, I couldn't possibly find anything of value. He assumed that his way of measuring worth, monetary value, and obvious prestige was the only way that mattered. And now those assumptions have cost him. And instead of acknowledging that he made a mistake, everyone wants to blame me for being thorough. My father stood up, his movement drawing everyone's attention. He walked to the window and stood looking out for a long moment before turning back to face us. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight I rarely heard from him. I need to say something, and I need everyone to listen. Really listen. The room fell silent. My father commanded respect when he chose to, and this was clearly one of those moments. My mother, he began, kept those paintings for over 40 years. She and my father knew they were valuable. They had them authenticated. They could have sold them at any time, used the money for house repairs or vacations or to help put me through college. But they chose to keep them. They wrapped them carefully, stored them safely, and they kept them. He paused, his eyes moving around the room, landing on each person. Now, why do you suppose they did that? Why keep something valuable hidden away in the attic instead of selling it or displaying it? No one answered. Victor had stopped pacing. My mother's hands were still in her lap. Everyone waited. I think, my father continued, they were saving them. For what or for whom? I don't know. Maybe they hoped to pass them down to me, and then I'd pass them to my children. Maybe they just loved the paintings and couldn't bear to part with them. Or maybe they understood something about value that we've forgotten. He looked at me, his eyes soft. Gabby found those paintings because she was looking for my mother, for the person behind the possessions. She read her journals. She cared about her memories. Everyone else was looking for things to sell, or keep, or display. Gabby was looking for Grandma. His words created a thickness in my throat, made my eyes sting with tears I was determined not to shed in front of everyone. Victor, my father said, turning to my brother, you're angry because you feel foolish. You missed something valuable, and that hurts your pride. I understand that. But son, you need to hear this. Your sister didn't take anything from you, you gave it away. You decided those boxes were worthless without looking inside them. That was your choice, and choices have consequences. Victor's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. Something in our father's tone made it clear that argument wouldn't be tolerated. My father looked at my mother and aunt and uncle. And the rest of you need to stop trying to guilt Gabby into sharing. She doesn't owe anyone a portion of her inheritance. Those paintings are hers, legally and morally. If she chooses to share, that's her generosity. But it's not an obligation. The room stayed quiet after he finished. My mother looked like she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Aunt Patricia studied her hands. Uncle Keith cleared his throat uncomfortably. And Victor stood frozen, his face a mask I couldn't read. I found my voice, steadier now. I want to show you something. I went to my bedroom and retrieved the box of journals I'd kept separate. I brought it back and set it on the coffee table. These are Grandma's journals, spanning from 1942 to about 2010. Decades of her life, her thoughts, her experiences. They're extraordinary. She wrote about the war, about raising Dad, about life in Riverside, about marriage and loss and joy, and everyday moments that meant something to her. I pulled out one of the notebooks, the one from 1968, and opened it to the entry about the paintings. This is how I knew to look for them. She wrote about Grandpa, buying them, about having them authenticated, about deciding to keep them. Her words led me to them. I looked up at my family. I'm going to make copies of these journals for everyone who wants them. These are family history, and they should be shared. The photographs I found, I'll scan them and create albums for everyone. The vintage fabrics, if anyone wants them for quilting or sewing projects, they're available. The things that matter for memory and connection. I'm happy to share. My mother's expression softened. You'd do that. Share the journals and photos. Of course those are meant to be shared, they're our family story. I paused, but the paintings are different. They're worth significant money, yes, but they're also my security. Do you know what teachers make, Mom? What Owen makes as a professor? We live comfortably but modestly. We have student loans. We rent instead of own. We budget carefully. These paintings represent freedom from financial anxiety. The ability to maybe buy a house someday. To not worry about car repairs or medical bills. To breathe a little easier. I saw understanding start to dawn on my mother's face. She'd spent her life worried about money, married to an accountant who did well but never spectacularly. She understood financial insecurity, in a way Victor, with his six-figure salary and investment portfolio, never had. I haven't decided what I'll do with the paintings yet. I continued. I might sell one and keep the rest. I might keep them all and just have them as assets. I might donate one to a museum in Grandma's name. The point is, it's my choice to make, and I'm asking all of you to respect that. My father nodded. That's more than fair, sweetheart. Victor finally spoke, his voice strained. I can't believe this. I can't believe you're all just accepting this. What would you have us do, son? My father asked. Force your sister to give you paintings that you threw away. Take her to court over items you designated as garbage. Think about what you're saying. I'm saying that family should look out for each other. Victor said, but his conviction was wavering. That windfalls should be shared. Then where was that attitude when you were dividing up the estate? I asked. Where was the impulse to share when you were taking the valuable furniture and silver? You had no problem keeping those things for yourself. He had no answer to that. The hypocrisy was too obvious. Owen, who'd been quietly supportive throughout, spoke up. I think what's happening here is a fundamental disagreement about fairness. Victor, you feel it's unfair that Gabby got something valuable when you did all the work of managing the estate. But from another perspective, it's unfair that Gabby was excluded from estate decisions, and only got leftovers until those leftovers turned out to be valuable. Both things can feel unfair, but only one of them is legally sound. Gabby owns those paintings free and clear. I could contest it. Victor said, but there was no real fight in his voice anymore. I could argue that she had knowledge I didn't have when she took them. You could try, Owen agreed, and you'd lose. Because she didn't have knowledge. She had journals she hadn't read yet, and intuition about items that meant something to her grandmother. You can't contest someone's good instincts. The fight seemed to drain out of Victor all at once. He sat down heavily in one of my kitchen chairs, his head in his hands. For a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost, but then I remembered every dismissive comment, every comparison, every time he'd made me feel small for choosing a life he didn't understand. My sympathy had limits. My mother broke the tension by standing and walking over to me. She put her hands on my shoulders and looked directly into my eyes. I'm proud of you, she said, and I could tell the words cost her something. My mother didn't often admit when she was wrong, didn't easily acknowledge that her judgments might be flawed. You honored your grandmother in a way the rest of us didn't. You saw value where we saw clutter, and you're right, the paintings are yours. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was close enough. I hugged her, feeling some of the tension leave my body. Thank you, Mom. The gathering broke up shortly after that. Aunt Patricia and Uncle Keith left first, hugging me with what seemed like genuine warmth, though Uncle Keith did mutter something about wishing he'd paid more attention to the garage items. My mother and father stayed a bit longer. Dad looked through one of the journals I showed him, his eyes misting as he read his mother's words about his childhood. Mom asked detailed questions about the authentication process, and I could tell she was genuinely interested, not just making conversation. Victor left last, pausing at the door. I still think you should share, he said, but there was no heat in it anymore, just resignation. I know you do, I replied, but Victor, think about what you're really angry about. Is it the money, or is it that your little sister, the art teacher you've never taken seriously, found something you missed? Is it that I was right to take those boxes when you called them junk? He stared at me for a long moment. Maybe both, he finally admitted. It's hard, Gabby. I've always been the successful one, the one who made the right choices, who knew how to navigate the world, and you just stumbled into a fortune by being sentimental. I didn't stumble, I said quietly. I paid attention, there's a difference. After he left, Owen and I cleaned up in silence, throwing away paper plates and washing wine glasses. When the apartment was restored to order, we collapsed on the couch together, exhausted. That was intense, Owen said, pulling me close. How are you feeling? I thought about it. Relieved, vindicated. A little sad, mostly relieved. You handled it beautifully. I was so proud of you standing your ground like that. I almost caved when my mom started in about sharing. Old habits, you know, the urge to please, to smooth things over, to be the good daughter who doesn't make waves. But you didn't cave, you held firm. That took courage. We sat quietly for a while, processing the afternoon's drama. Then Owen asked the question I'd been avoiding thinking about too directly. So what are you going to do with the paintings? Have you really not decided? I sighed. I have some ideas. I think I'll sell two of them, the landscapes. They're beautiful, but they're not the kind of art that speaks to me personally. The harbor scene and the Riverside village, I can appreciate their technical skill without needing to own them. That would give us enough money to make a real difference in our lives. Pay off your student loans and mine, down payment on a house, real financial security. And the other two, the still life and the portrait, those I want to keep, at least for now. The way the artist captured light, the emotion in the portrait subject's face, I look at them and I feel something. They're not just valuable objects, they're art that moves me. And I think Grandma would like that, knowing they went to someone who appreciated them for what they are, not just what they're worth. Owen kissed the top of my head. That sounds perfect. A balance of practical and personal. I'm also thinking about the journals, I continued. I meant what I said about sharing them, but I want to do something more. I'm going to transcribe them. All of them, and compile them into a book. A family history told in Grandma's own words. We could print copies for everyone, preserve her voice for future generations. That's a beautiful idea, I'll help you. We could spend evenings working on it together. The image he painted, the two of us sitting side by side transcribing my grandmother's life, felt right in a way I couldn't fully articulate. It honored her memory, preserved family history, and turned her private journals into a shared legacy. The paintings might be financially valuable, but the journals were the real treasure, the record of a life fully lived, fully felt, fully documented. Over the next few weeks, life shifted into a new normal. I contacted the auction house Dr. Westfield had recommended and arranged to sell the two landscape paintings. The process was slower than I'd expected, involving provenance verification and catalog preparation, and waiting for the right sale. But the auction house was confident about the estimates, and I learned patience. I had the portrait and still life professionally reframed and hung them in our living room, where I could see them every day. Guests who visited often paused to admire them, and I took quiet pleasure in explaining their history, how my grandfather had found them, how my grandmother had preserved them, how I'd discovered them in a box marked for disposal. The journals project became my evening routine. Every night after dinner, Owen and I would sit at our kitchen table, and I'd read aloud from Grandma's notebooks while he typed, capturing her words in digital format. Her voice came alive in those sessions, her humor and wisdom and occasional exasperation with the world. We laughed at her descriptions of neighborhood characters from the 1950s. We teared up reading about her grief when Grandpa died. We felt the texture of her life, the dailiness of it, the accumulation of small moments that made up a remarkable existence. My relationship with my family evolved too, though not always smoothly. My mother called more often, and our conversations had a new quality to them, more substance, less performance. She asked about the journal transcription project and eventually requested copies of sections that mentioned her, which I provided without comment. She was trying, in her way, to understand both her mother-in-law and her daughter better. Victor and I maintained a cautious peace. He didn't apologize for his reaction or his attempt to claim the paintings, but he stopped actively resenting my discovery. We saw each other at family gatherings and managed polite conversation. The dynamic between us had shifted permanently. I was no longer the little sister whose choices he could dismiss, and he was no longer the unquestioned authority on what mattered and what didn't. My father became my most unexpected ally. He asked to read each journal as I finished transcribing it, and we'd have long phone conversations about his memories compared to his mother's written record. He shared stories I'd never heard, filled in context for her entries, brought her words to life with his recollections. In those conversations, I got to know him better than I had in my entire previous life, saw him not just as my father, but as a man who'd loved his mother deeply and grieved her loss profoundly. The estate sale had happened in October. By the time spring arrived, bringing with it the auction of my two paintings, my life looked completely different. The paintings sold for more than the estimates, bringing in nearly $60,000 after fees and commission. Owen and I paid off our student loans in full. The weight of that debt lifting felt like learning to fly. We started seriously house hunting, looking for something with space for both of us to work and room to grow. We found a small house in West Hartford, not far from Owen's university, with a yard and a porch and enough bedrooms that one could be my art studio and another Owen's home office. The day we moved in, I hung the portrait and the still life in our living room, places of honor where they could be seen and appreciated. And in my studio, I created a small gallery wall of the family photographs I'd found in Grandma's boxes, images spanning a century, visual proof of where I'd come from. The completed journal transcription took me almost a year. I had each entry dated and organized chronologically, added footnotes explaining references that might not be clear to future readers, and included photographs where appropriate. I had 20 copies printed and bound in hardcover, the kind of book that looked and felt substantial, worthy of the life it contained. I gave copies to my parents, Victor, aunts and uncles, cousins, anyone with connection to Grandma's story. The dedication read, "For Margaret Norton, who understood that the most valuable things in life are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to look." At the family gathering where I distributed the books, something remarkable happened. People who'd barely spoken to each other in years found common ground in Grandma's words. Cousins compared notes on events she'd described. My mother cried reading about her own wedding from Grandma's perspective. Even Victor seemed moved, though he hid it behind compliments about the book's production quality. Later that evening, Victor pulled me aside. We stood on my parents' back deck, the spring evening cool and promising. "I read some of the journal already," he said without preamble. "The parts about when we were kids." "Yeah?" She wrote about both of us differently than I expected. I thought, I don't know, that she'd have favorites or preferences. But she just loved us, saw us clearly, understood our different qualities, loved us equally. I waited, sensing he had more to say. "She wrote about you discovering art, how excited you got about colors and shapes. She said you saw the world in a way she wished she could see it. That your art wasn't a hobby or a phase, it was a calling." He paused. "I never understood that. I thought you were wasting potential, choosing a low-paying career when you could have done something more lucrative. But maybe I was measuring with the wrong ruler." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever gotten from Victor, and I recognized it for the peace offering it was. "We measure differently," I said. "That's okay. The world needs both kinds of people." "I'm sorry," he said, the words clearly difficult. "About the paintings, about trying to claim them. I was wrong. Dad was right, you found them because you were looking for her, not for valuable things. I should have respected that." "Thank you," I said simply, "because sometimes that's all that's needed, acknowledgement and acceptance." "Are you happy?" he asked. "With your house and your art and your quiet life?" I thought about my students, about the moment a child's face lights up when they create something they're proud of. I thought about Owen and our home, and the paintings on our walls. I thought about Grandma's journals and the legacy I'd helped preserve. "Yes," I said. "I'm happy. Are you?" He considered the question seriously. "I'm successful. I'm not sure that's the same thing." We stood together in comfortable silence, two siblings who'd never been close finding a moment of genuine connection. It wouldn't transform our relationship overnight, but it was a start, a foundation to build on if we both chose to. As the evening wound down and Owen and I prepared to leave, my mother handed me a small box. "I found this when I was cleaning out my jewelry box," she said. "It was your grandmother's. She gave it to me years ago, but I think she'd want you to have it." Inside was a simple gold locket. I opened it to find two tiny photographs, one of my grandfather as a young man in his army uniform, the other of Grandma herself, probably from the same era. They looked impossibly young, full of hope and future, unaware of all the years they'd share, the life they'd build, the love that would sustain them through joy and loss. "Thank you," I whispered, fastening the locket around my neck. It settled against my heart, a weight both literal and metaphorical. Driving home that night, Owen reached over and took my hand. "You did it," he said. "You found treasure in the junk pile, stood up to your family, preserved your grandmother's legacy, and came out of it with your integrity intact. That's remarkable, Gabby." I looked out the window at the passing streetlights, thinking about the journey from that estate sale day to this moment. "I just paid attention," I said. "I looked at what everyone else dismissed and decided it mattered." "That's a rare gift," Owen replied. "The ability to see value where others see none." But I'd learned something more profound than that. I'd learned that value isn't inherent in objects, or achievements, or status symbols. Value is assigned by what we choose to notice, what we decide matters, how we measure worth. My family had looked at Grandma's possessions and seen items to sell or display. I'd looked and seen a life, a story, a person who deserved to be remembered fully. The paintings hanging in our living room weren't just valuable art anymore. They were proof that Grandpa had an eye for beauty and quality. They were evidence that Grandma understood preservation and patience. They were symbols of a couple who chose to keep something precious rather than convert it to cash, who passed down not just objects but values. And in the end, that was the real inheritance, not the monetary value of the paintings, not even the historical value of the journals, but the lesson that the most important things in life often hide in unexpected places, waiting for someone willing to look past surface appearances to find the treasure beneath. Months later, I received a letter from a distant cousin I barely knew, someone who'd received a copy of Grandma's journals. She wrote about reading Grandma's entry from 1967, where she'd described helping a young neighbor girl who was struggling in school. That neighbor girl had been my cousin's mother, and Grandma's kindness had changed the trajectory of her life. The cousin had never known the full story until reading it in Grandma's own words. The letter ended, "Thank you for giving us back a piece of her, for seeing that her words and memories mattered as much as any physical possession. You've given our family something priceless." I kept that letter in my desk drawer, taking it out sometimes when I needed reminding that the choices we make ripple outward in ways we can't always predict. By valuing what others dismissed, by taking the time to look carefully at what everyone else overlooked, I'd created something that mattered far beyond myself. The story could have ended differently. I could have left those boxes in Grandma's garage, accepting my family's judgment that they were worthless. Victor could have opened that crate and found the paintings himself. The estate sale could have proceeded without me ever knowing what had been lost. But none of those things happened, because I made a different choice. I chose to see value in memories and personal histories. I chose to trust my instincts over my family's dismissals. I chose to take what no one else wanted and treat it as precious. And in doing so, I found more than paintings worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I found my grandmother's voice preserved across decades. I found family history that would have been lost. I found the courage to stand up for myself against people who'd spent my whole life telling me I was impractical and overly sentimental. I found that sometimes being sentimental and impractical leads you exactly where you need to be. The paintings still hang in our living room, beautiful reminders of an artist's skill, and my grandparents' taste and my own determination to look beyond surfaces. But when people ask about them, what I remember most isn't their value or their beauty. I remember the moment of unwrapping them in my small apartment, hands shaking with discovery. I remember reading Grandma's journal entry by lamplight, her words leading me to treasure. I remember my father's voice when he said I'd been looking for her, not for valuable things, and the truth of that observation settling into my bones. That's what I found in Grandma's junk pile, not just paintings or journals or photographs, but permission to trust myself, validation that my way of seeing the world had worth, proof that paying attention to what others dismiss can lead to discoveries beyond price. The paintings made me financially secure, but the journey made me whole. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.